Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here tonight for this lecture. I'm Lee Markopoulos, the chair of CCA's Curatorial Practice MA program, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, curator and writer, Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev. Carolyn's visit to San Francisco is but one stop on an extensive West Coast trip and would not have been possible without the support of a number of people. And so tonight I'd like to start by thanking in particular Jens Hoffman, the director of the Wattis Institute, and his staff, and especially Sue Ellen Stone. For those of you who were present for Carolyn's introduction at SFAI's panel, Global Art in the Downturn, last night, this may feel a little like déjà vu. But even for those of us familiar with her extensive achievements, the following highlights are a testament to her remarkable career. Currently the interim director of the Castello di Rivoli Museum of Contemporary Art in Turin, but resigning at the end of this year to take up fully her appointment as director of Documenta 13, which is slated for 2012, Carolyn early on gained recognition for her work as an independent curator in Europe and subsequently as senior curator at PS1 New York. Her numerous exhibitions from the early 90s until 2001 include the group presentation around 1984, a look at art in the 80s, and solo shows of Georges Adiagbo, Santiago Sierra, Michael Rakovitz, and Nedko Solikov, as well as the first retrospective exhibition of Janet Cardiff's works. At PS1, Carolyn also initiated and co-curated Greater New York, a collaboration with MoMA that documented the emergence of a new generation of artists in the city and that has since become a quinquennial fixture on the New York art scene. Since joining Castello di Rivoli in 2002 as chief curator, Carolyn has been instrumental in creating and shaping its collection and in sustaining a highly regarded program of exhibitions, cementing the museum's reputation as one of Europe's foremost venues for contemporary art. In her exhibition practice, as in her writing, she has pursued the relations between historical avant-gardes and contemporary art, and has written extensively on the 1960s Arte Povera movement. Her Arte Povera book was published by Phaidon in 1999. She also has written important monographs to accompany her surveys of the work of William Kentridge and Pierre Huyghe, amongst others, and has contributed essays to numerous publications over the last 20 years. In addition to her activities at the Castello, Carolyn has organized major group shows, such as the first Torino Triennale, together with Francesco Bonami, which took place in 2005, and most recently she was artistic director of the acclaimed 2008 Sydney Biennale, an exhibition of more than 180 artists entitled Revolutions, Forms That Turn. The Biennale focused, according to Carolyn, on the formal gestures embedded in the etymology of the word revolution, that is, inversion, reversing, and rotating. And according to Max Delaney, writing in the September 2008 issue of Frieze, this Biennale was a tour de force comprising dizzying discursive loops and spiraling trajectories of avant-garde aesthetics and political reprisals, through which Christov-Bakargiev brilliantly marshaled artists and theorists to rethink the terms revolution, agency, and effect, and the ways in which contemporary art might activate new modes of critical understanding and revolutionary potential. Tonight, Carolyn will give us a few notes about Documenta, with the proviso that it is 2.5 years away, and so nothing should be taken as binding. And on that note, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev.
Thank you very much, Lee. That was quite a summary of things. And yes, it is 2.5 years away, and therefore I'm in the mode of looking at the past of Documenta and not exactly yet too much in the mode of what it will be. Even though for some science research, 2.5 years is nothing, and for many exhibitions that are not international periodic group exhibitions about contemporary art, 2.5 years is also nothing. So the sense of time changes, of course, for us constantly. Now, as we speak tonight, well, first I would like to also thank the CCA for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and has been an opportunity to see some of the students and to also see artists and other people in this area during the interstice of the obligations. There's also a Skype connection on, because at the same time as we are here, we're missing something very interesting. We're missing two things very interesting. One is Candice Bright's talk at SF MoMA, and the other is this people who are these group of artists, young artists at SFAI graduate people, and they're doing something called Birth of a Nation tonight, and they're trying to think about different ways of organizing artistic practice. So we're actually with them, and they're through some Skype connection, which is this new stuff of these years that I didn't have when I was your age, but they're there. So they're there now, and we're here now. There are three questions that interest me, but before I tell them, I must tell you that last night the panel was very humorous, and we had a nice conversation with all those people. However, tonight is going to be very serious, because Documenta is very serious. So that is not a joke. So as we begin then with this endeavor, I'm going to turn down the volume here, because they're really making a lot of noise over there, wherever they are. Okay, so there are three questions that interest me: where we are, where we come from, and where we might be going, and why. And I'm interested in these three questions: where we are, where we come from, and where we might be going, and why, from different focal points. From the point in terms of time, from the point of view of evolutionary time, from the point of view of personal time, and from the point of view of historical time. And I'm interested in general in life in creating constellations of thought and experience. Now there's going to be a serious sentence here, a serious bit of a sentence, but I actually believe it, for the purpose of living responsibly and thinking through our existence. And what that might mean is interesting, of course, to me. So this talk will address various things, different things, what I think about and where I come from and where I might be going. And a thing is a very interesting concept, because a thing is a very vague thing. But a thing is also a ding, and the ding is the parliament in the ancient Germanic peoples' political organizations. So actually a thing is a parliament. Okay, that said, I'm going to start by answering the first question, which is not where we are, nor where we come from, nor where we might be going and why. However, it is going to be, what is Documenta for? And take you on a bit of a journey. So what you see in this picture is Otto Hessler's public housing project from 1928. It was thought of in the late 20s and never completed because the Nazi takeover of power and the financial crisis of 1929. So it was only partially built. And it was considered by many people to be one of the most interesting housing projects in Europe, in modernist architecture at the time. And nobody goes to see this usually when they go to Documenta. But they might in the future. And one of the most extraordinary things in this public housing project of 1928 was, that was only partially built, was that on the roof there is a like a laundromat, old laundromat, where there were sinks and for washing laundry, and then those were substituted more recently by washing machines in the post-war era of reconstruction of Germany. But there is an incredible system of drying clothes, which in a place that rains is difficult. And the system is made by a glass structure that has two inclined planes and open and glass windows that open at a slant on the sides of this space. So what happens is that the sun, just like in a serra, in a hothouse where you grow plants, heats the air inside, dries the clothes, and the humidity evaporates and goes out of these slanted windows. And so there's no use of electricity at all, and it works perfectly well. And that is one side of German modern architecture that did not turn into the Nazi concentration camps at all. However, it was forgotten, and it would work. And if we put that on every building in New York, we would not need dryers ever, even if it's snowing and raining. And that's interesting to remember the way things go in the wrong direction. And when the Nazis came into power shortly after the financial crisis, they didn't like these buildings. They thought they were very ugly, and they didn't look like proper German architecture. So all around it, if you go to this place, you see curved houses like a citadel that was built around to contain this virus, and the roofs are slanting. And they're slanting so that the snow can fall off when it snows. And they also look like the Middle Ages, and or 19th century view of some idyllic past of Germany. So the slanted windows turned into the slanted roofs that don't dry clothes anymore, and electricity was then necessary to do that in the future. Okay, so that was the first slide. So what is Documenta therefore for? Traditionally, Documenta. Voila. Traditionally, Documenta thinks through its zeitgeist and the meaning and role of art and culture in the world. I actually have a written lecture, so I'm going to read it. It reflects its time and on its time according to the perspective of its artistic director and the participating artists. Generally, at 5-year intervals, it also takes its time to do this. Indeed, to direct Documenta today is one of the most anachronistic things that you can do in the art world. Young artists don't even know what Documenta is. I'm constantly verifying this by asking them, and they've never heard of it. And that's interesting. I think we just lost the Skype connection. Hello? I was about to teach them what Documenta is, but it can't seem to function. Hello? Hello? They're gone. So they will continue to not know what Documenta is. So Documenta began in 1955, and Documenta is a state of mind, basically. Now it's a state of mind. So Documenta began in 1955, the same year as the Bundesrepublik Deutschland entered into the NATO alliance, just 3 years after the Bundesrepublik Deutschland achieved full sovereignty with the writing of the Grundgesetz, the Constitution, in 1952, and only 6 years after the 1949 unification of the British, USA, and French military-controlled zones into the BRD, and only 10 years after the close of World War II in 1945. That first edition, which therefore gives a genetic lineage to Documenta, which is different from the Biennales. So the greatest thing about doing Documenta is that it's not a Biennale. And therefore, we don't have to discuss the Biennale Syndrome ever from now until 2012 or 13. At least I don't. I'm out of that discussion, out completely, of the Biennale discussion. That first edition could be seen as an antithesis to the 1937 exhibition Entartete Kunst. With 148 primarily European artists, it included many who had been banned by the Nazi regime, such as Beckmann, Ernst, Kandinsky, Kirchner, Picasso, and Schwitters, as well as some of the younger contemporary post-war artists, such as Hartung, Soulage, and Vols. It was primarily a show of art from generations prior to the 1955 exhibition. It was not an exhibition of contemporary art. They're making a lot of noise. We have to lower this. disturbing. Okay. All this came about in a city that had been severely bombed in 1943, with a destruction of 90% of its city center by British bombers. Enormous civilian casualties in 2 hours of bombing. Up to 10,000 people died in 2 hours on October 21st, I think, 1943. And the sudden creation of 150,000 homeless people who the Nazi regime wanted out of town to not see the ruins. So Kassel fell from 1943 until the mid-50s almost into a kind of time warp. Nobody could go into the city center. Nobody saw the destruction. People were living on the outskirts. Of course, the wealthy neighborhoods were fine. All of the 19th century parts of Kassel were not bombed, because the only areas that were bombed were the areas that were heavily and densely populated by the workers of the factories. The factories were, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I'm nonetheless going to say this without the text. The factories were the factories where the German tanks were built. So all of the Nazi military armaments, all of the, whatever they were called, Tiger tanks and so on, were built in Kassel. And therefore, that was the cause, perhaps, or surely, of the bombings. However, the factories were not bombed at all, and the factories started to work again 6 months after the end of the war. What was bombed was the humans who worked in the factories, because that would stop the factories from making the tanks without destroying the infrastructure, which is very important to the post-war era, of course. But the other thing that was destroyed with the bombs were culture, because the center of town was the medieval town. So it had all the medieval churches, small. So there is no Middle Ages anymore in Kassel. And the Friedrichianum was bombed severely in 1941. The main venue of the Documenta was the biggest library practically in Germany, and it had the Middle Ages in it, because everything that Luther didn't destroy at the time of the Reform, of the preceding manuscripts and Bibles and all that stuff, it was all wiped out later in this other bombing of 1941. So the great library that was the Friedrichianum, where the Brothers Grimm worked as librarians, was destroyed with thousands and thousands and thousands of books. Some of them were saved. Like there are these photographs of children taking them out and drying them the next morning. The idea was that if you bombed people, they would go against their horrible Nazi government. But actually, that didn't happen. What human beings tend to do is, even if the government is horrible and repressive, if you bomb those people, they actually like their government more, which is a rule that anybody knows, that is apparent in a family, but it doesn't work in the history of human beings and our governments. We seem to keep repeating these problems of trying to solve a problem with the same problem. So the only buildings that were not bombed were a few symbolic buildings, such as the Museum Friedrichianum, of which I don't have a slide, Europe's oldest public museum. It was opened in 1779, so 2 years after the opening of the British Museum, and traditionally remains, since forever, the main venue of the Documenta exhibitions. Kassel, this is the part that I already told you. Kassel had been a major center of political power, the House of Hessian, Landgrave, and the Prince Electoral, and economic power, with its machine industry for locomotives, cars, and armaments, themselves the prime reason for the bombings. The Hessians, of course, you may know, because they fought as mercenaries in the Revolutionary War here. So the Hessian Landgraves were able to collect that incredible collection that they had, which was not in the Friedrichianum but in the Rote Palais, and now is also in the Wilhelmshöhe, an incredible collection of art and antiquities, thanks to sending mercenaries into the Revolutionary Wars for the British. So that's another interesting connection between art and power and culture of the past. which, one will write the story of today in the future. Kassel had been, therefore, that. And it was an economic power since the time of Bismarck in the 1800s, with its machine industry for locomotives, cars, and armaments, which were themselves, as I said before, the prime reason for the bombings. It's therefore a city where a traumatic past was mostly erased by the architecture of reconstruction. So, and I stop for a second, the logical topic to address in the next documenta should be collapse and recovery, because that's very topical now, given that there's been this collapse and recovery, and we're talking all about collapse and recovery. Therefore, it will not be the theme of the next documenta. I'm trying to find the most boring theme of the next documenta, because documenta has to be boring. It's like in its genetic thing. So I'm trying to find that. Now, if I did it on collapse and recovery, it would be too easy, and it can't do that. So now to go back to the etymology of the name documenta, it's a very interesting word, and it reflected the urgency of that time to avoid the collapse of culture and intellectuality that had occurred during the Nazi period by teaching, because docere means to teach, and therefore documentum in the plural documenta means lessons, a lesson, a teaching. And in particular, it was used by the Romans to speak of a warning. So documenta are a set of warnings, which makes it very pesante. So in the hope, and the reason why Arnold Bode founded this endeavor, and he was an artist, like many of yourselves, they didn't have curators at the time, and there were no curatorial schools at the time. There were artists who sometimes organized things, and he did these landscapes that were okay, but they weren't the best paintings of the world. But he also liked to build things of all sorts, physical structures and systems, and systemic structures and systems. So he did everything. He would do the design of the chairs and the benches and the installation and the plinths and invite the artists and everything. And because it's a big thing to do, documenta, you can't do it by yourself. He had his friend Werner Haftmann help him, who was a modernist historian, art historian, one of the sort of Clement Greenbergs of Europe, Werner Haftmann, who happened to have a house in Venice. And so Werner Haftmann would see all of the Venice Biennales and thought that Germany should have a Venice Biennale, and that's how it started in these conversations. And that explains why there were so many Italian artists in the early documentas. There were maybe 40% Italian artists, and then 20, it went down to 20, then it went down to 2, and now it's at 0. The last documenta had 0. So there's a lot of vested interest in Italy in my being the director of documenta, because there's the hope that we might rise again to the 40% of the first documenta. So that was that story of why Burri and Consagra and Afro and all those people were in the first documentas, Fontana and all of that. The hope that he had was that the 20th century modernist avant-garde, we have to see him though. There he is, with Jackson Pollock, that he brought to Kassel. Now, one of the storylines goes that the documenta is a cultural arm of the CIA, basically, in the Cold War period, because Kassel is very near the border with Eastern Germany, and so it was to be the expression of cultural freedom at the time in Europe. So, and that may well be true, as it is true that there is a lot of interesting texts about the funding of abstract expressionist shows in Europe in the post-war period. But you must always wonder about the French. It's mostly the French who have written those texts, and they've got their reasons. So being Italian, partly Italian and partly Bulgarian for that matter, which is a whole other thing, I'm a bit suspicious about those texts, because I think it's a sort of a jealousy between Mathieu and Pollock. So I have nothing against, Pollock myself personally. I think he was very handsome and all sorts of things. So formal intellectual. So the hope that Arnold Bode had was that the 20th century modernist avant-garde might still fulfill its dream and emancipate mankind. which is a big hope. And I think that was also part of it. Formal, intellectual, and aesthetic freedoms were synonymous with moral and social freedom. Developing from those beginnings, Documenta, a safe haven for art and a celebration of culture, has come to represent a key periodic moment when the art world meets and assesses the situation and where the urgencies that define our present time can be elaborated. When Documenta began, the formal and aesthetic freedom of post-war abstraction ran parallel to the re-establishment of a liberal economy. Today, Documenta provides instead a platform where the extreme and also problematic consequences of a purely liberal economy can be assessed through art and culture. In our contradictory time, more and more people are interested and invested in art. On the other hand, there's been a healthy decentralization to areas of the world previously not participating in the primarily Western discussions and discourses of contemporary art. Biennales, so I put it in the text anyway, emerging in crucial moments in the history of civil societies, aka Gwangju Biennale and the Gwangju uprisings, etc., therefore fit within a form of new ecology of the art world, pursuing hybrid and decentered cultural models. On the other hand, at this time we also witnessed a rise of the art market to an unprecedented degree, with the consequential emphasis on the art object as the ultimate status symbol. In this light, the role of Documenta as a moment of reflection, I think, could be important today as ever. However, defining an objective zeitgeist may be less possible or less necessary today in this age, as we all call it, of complexity and multiplicity and simultaneity of contexts, histories, and trajectories, and in a proliferation of international exhibitions that one could call the Biennale Syndrome, which all attempt to capture what's topical now. And the internet has broadened access to information since the early 90s. Those of you who are young, I mean, for me, one of the biggest dates is 1994 in the history of the late 20th century, which is when I got my first email account. And that was essential because there's the before 1994 and there's the after 1994, which is only 10 years after 1984, which is very interesting. That's when the first email accounts were. And it just changed the whole thing. So those of you who come after are the laziest people in the world on the one hand, because you just Google things like immediately. I sit in a car with one of you and I say, well, do you know who so-and-so was? And they Google it immediately on the BlackBerry or on the iPhone or something. And on the other hand, they're the most energetic and widely, open to traversing, to crossing different fields and being curious. And I really believe in that curiosity. But I belong to the generation that remembers there was an adult before and there was an adult that is an adult after, at least for a while. And furthered the exchange of opinions, this internet thing, and digital elaboration of collective forms of knowledge by building transversal networks and archives. But its bits, blogs, and summaries have also ushered in an ever more indirect experience of knowledge and a partial collapse of intellectuality, as well as a collapse of the ethics of behavior, I think, of generosity, for example, and integrity. Information and knowledge are more accessible to those with technology. Anyone online is able to contribute their point of view, but the content is often superficial and detached from forms of direct responsibility that come with physical encounters, as one sees when you have children committing suicide because somebody is putting something on the internet in Florida and causing that. That would never happen when you have the direct responsibility of the physical encounter because somebody hits you on the nose. With physical, it's painful when there's the bodies are together. So today, anyone can read a summary of Adorno's ideas on the net. With the absorption of what was once called advanced art and avant-garde art into the mainstream culture industry to such a degree that even the notion of autonomy or negativity have been fully integrated, the question of Documenta could be an interesting one, and I hope it is. But to hold a critical sense of the present time, we need to understand it by relating it to ideas of the recent past. How does time pass, and what is time in terms of how we experience it? The question is not, therefore, how we historicize the past, but rather how the present tense was understood in the recent past, and how this notion was primarily constructed in the 20th century, And with that, I'd say I find Alain Badiou's book on the 20th century quite interesting. For example, Documenta 2 in 1959 understood its present tense by focusing on art after 1945. And one of the things it did was it did a sculpture garden outside of the Orangerie with big sculptures, now in bronze. Now, we understand this to be a rather old-fashioned thing to do now. But if you think of the fact that if we were to eliminate guards and security from the museums, one of the few solutions would be to put in bronze sculptures. You understand how things such as ephemeral work, video, fragile, poor materials, and this comes from me knowing that arte povera is not about the materials, it's about the procedures. And I tried to write that, but people still think it's about poor materials. But if you think about that, then you could say that Documenta of bronze in the Friedrichshainum with no guards and security might be a more arte povera endeavor than one filled with fragile pieces of paper, poor materials, gestures, performances, and blah, blah, blah. But that's just to say that this was really interesting at the time. So the second Documenta, 1959, contrary to the first, understood its present tense by focusing on art after 1945. And the art historian Haftmann that I mentioned suggested in that exhibition that the abstract painting of Tachisme, Informel, etc., was the aesthetic correlative of the freedom that was part of the Reconstruction era in the 50s. In the 50s, a lot of ballrooms were built in Kassel, lots of ballrooms where people would meet and dance together. Documenta 3, I don't have a slide of, in 1964, on the other hand, had brought together works ranging from the late 19th century to the present, selected by an international committee as individual artists' works rather than as representatives of groups or tendencies. Salute. In 1968, the Documenta 4 experimented with space and unconventional displays with environments which embodied the notion that art and aesthetic change stand at the center of political transformation. And 1968 marks the second phase of Documenta. So 1955 to 1968 excluded, and then 1968, I would say, to 1997 excluded. This second phase is best embodied by the Documenta of Harold Zeeman, who called his 1972 Documenta a 100-day event instead of the 100-day museum, which is what Arnold Bode called it. And the zeitgeist he suggested was reached by his visionary sense of anarchist individualism expressed through his intuitive selection process that denied any theoretical definition of artistic movements. Yet this point of view paradoxically did represent, on a curatorial level, precisely the same radical individualism of post-minimalist process-oriented art and arte povera who were his contemporaries and friends. Zeeman enacted an observer-dependent and process-oriented form of curating that went against the extraneous interpretative gaze of what is happening in art. And that's one of the reasons why I have no slides of his show, because it doesn't make any sense to do that. During the 1980s and 1990s, the Documenta exhibitions followed the general trend in the art world of focusing on individual artists in a certain artwork and on their artworks as objects, rather than proposing any strong interpretative theme or point of view on art and art history, or on art and politics, or on art and public space that were also concurrently being practiced, or art and curatorial practice that was on the rise. In contrast, the 1997 Documenta by Catherine David broke with this attitude. She's the only woman who's done a Documenta up to now, but the statistics are rising with his attitude, broke with his attitude and focused once again on the avant-garde impulse, where art's primary role and agency is to resist mass culture and the society of spectacle. She was, of course, very involved in thinking about Godard and Foucault and all of that. She exhibited radical art of our time, reconnecting it to the radical practices of the 60s, with the works of Oiti Sika, Lydia Clark, Dan Graham, and other artists. This political and avant-garde tendency was followed by Okwuyen Wezor's 2002 Documenta 11, which intended to open up the boundaries of the traditionally Western art exhibition to a more global perspective. Based on post-colonial discourse and practice, Wezor focused on contemporary art with a political imperative from all over the world and decentralized, and this is extremely important, the public programs by initiating a series of worldwide discussion platforms. One platform was in Delhi, one platform was in Lagos, and so on. That led up to the fifth platform, which was the exhibition, the physical exhibition in Kassel. This global perspective was followed by Roger Burgel in 2007, both in terms of the artists exhibited and in terms of the magazine project, which was, however, not fully successful. But Documenta 12 appeared quite different from the preceding edition, with a strong focus on local education and public programs projects in Kassel that the international art world is virtually unaware of and is the strongest point of the last Documenta, and a controlled set of juxtapositions and salon-style installation of works, including works from the historical avant-gardes on the other. And the salon-style hang is perhaps the weakest part of that Documenta. There is a process and a conversation, I believe, that begins between contemporary artists. They're working towards a new artwork. Oh, here we go. I should stop and pause for a second. Okay, this is the title of the next Documenta. For now, it might change. And what it means is that, what it says is, der Tanz war sehr frenetisch, aufbrüllend, gerasselt, klingelnd, verdreht, rollende und dauerte für lange Zeit. And I'm learning German, which is great. I have a Goethe Institute teacher twice a week, and it's very interesting. And what it means is the dance was very frenetic. It was also rough. It was rattling. It was clanging. It was contorted and distorted. It was rolling, and it lasted for a long time. I like long titles. Okay. So I'm going to, basically the main problem in Documenta is traffic control, because 754,000 people visited it in the last edition, and even if you do a lousy exhibition, it always increases. Therefore, you have 3 months and about 800,000 people going through, which means a problem of crowd control, traffic, and real estate. So that is something that I think a lot about. Now, I'm going to switch to what is necessary. So generally speaking, there are many things that are necessary in the world today. And nothing is necessary in the world today. Life is not necessary. But there are many things that are necessary in the world today. Addressing the consequences of and the future of globalization by developing cultural forms that work through the problems inherent in this age of economic, social, and cultural interdependence. Addressing how we can imagine a society or multiple societies and governments based on degrowth. Imagining new structures of political organization in the age of the internet that might function more fairly than parliamentary democracy and engender less pain. Envisioning cultural and societal models and bonds based on something other than the pleasures of profit and consumer culture, which seem to have reached their end game and produce very little desire and pleasure. Understanding how perception and experience are articulated in the digital, and how these are constituted into knowledge, and how knowledge operates within this context. However, from the point of view of art, maybe I would suggest that integrity, generosity, fairness, and service, a conversational mode, time for intimacy, history, and the reimagination of the audience as singular instantiators of artworks are among the necessary categories to bear in mind, as opposed to this generic idea of audience. A clear sense, however, of what is necessary and the transmission of this sense to the artists participating in the exhibition, on my part, is absolutely not necessary, nor is it useful for the objective of creating an exhibition and a project where those necessities of contemporary culture are focused on and worked through collectively by artists, curator, and audience. I see the curator and the curator's thoughts and ideas about the world to be just as important as the singular ideas and points of view of each of the participating actors and artists, so that the curator is only one voice among the many that together create the web or constellation, which is the exhibition, if indeed it will be an exhibition. That's unclear, once it is activated by the engaged audience. We know what's not necessary. It's not necessary to mirror what's happening at the present moment. This is from a blog about Tehran after the elections. The great divide is the internet. Emails began around 1990, I said that already, and the rise of Google and other search engines has been steady throughout the last decade. Everything of any cultural or intellectual value has a short breathing span before it becomes known broadly. And we feel in this situation that we are more productive, but the number of conversations have actually decreased exponentially. The rise of curatorial practice as a profession that can be taught and learned is absolutely not necessary. It has caused a return to an old model of hierarchy, where the selection process has unfortunately become the key focus of exhibition making, the list of artists and the selection process. Selection is the essence of exclusion, which causes pain, and thus should never be the focus of curatorial practice. All the while, the rise of art fairs and auction houses has determined a market and investment-oriented art world to an even greater extent now than in the 1980s, that I thought was horrible. And this further supports a system of cultural transactions based on selection and exclusion rather than conversation and connection. I think conversation might be a way to relook at possibilities of art historical discourse, to look at certain conversations that occurred in the past that determined certain practices, such as, for example, conversations drinking beer, for example, in San Francisco. At a time when art exhibitions are the ultimate spectacle, it's necessary to resist this phenomenon and to reinvent them. However, it is important that this resistance avoid cynicism and the point of view according to which large-scale exhibitions are inevitably entertainment. This attitude inevitably leads to the belief that even the proposals of the avant-garde and the notions of negativity have fallen. There is indeed a temptation now to retreat into a small world of shared ideals, to reactivate a disempowered Western subjectivity, to adopt an inward and local focus. But cultural escapism and complacent melancholy present in European art today may not be a solution to the question of what is necessary. Cynicism comes from a sense of irreconcilability with the context one acts in. Indeed, any rule or system, even those that articulate the exchange of art, knowledge, and culture, is not immutable and can be changed. It's essential, therefore, to resist this closure, this withdrawal, although I do respect the thoughts of Lazzarato and Virno, and for Documenta to activate in continually creative terms dialogue and exchange. The recent financial crisis, although problematic in terms of the social consequences it may have, and it probably will have next year, may provide an opening, a chance, maybe an opportunity to exit an incestuous condition of art. One chooses moments of resistance and one chooses moments of indifference. Critical moments versus moments of retreat. We choose them consciously and unconsciously. It's important to address the issue of time and duration, the time of making an artwork and what happens during that time, the time of engaging with it in an exhibition. The information age lives under the sign of speed. Events multiply that are communicated via the media and the internet simultaneously, like Skype. Hello? Are you still there? They're not there. They're there, but they're not listening. Speed and the lack of time cause disarticulation in the field of memory, forms of amnesia and detachment. Instants are not processed, and time becomes statistical. Many small things occur simultaneously around the world, but because one is involved in more and more projects, one can find less time for each of them. Because each individual achieves less in each of the many activities he or she is involved in, each event needs to be co-authored, becoming the hybrid fruit of collective endeavor. This is therefore connected with the fragmentation of authorship the many voices of the blogs, Wikipedia, and YouTube clips. However, often we don't think about the free labor that's going into creating all these digital archives, such as YouTube, or the fact that Facebook is private property and so on. In social media, such as Facebook, the I is ubiquitous and being can mean many things. On the one hand, this hybrid dissemination truly ushers in a form of democracy through access to knowledge, only reserved, however, to those who have access to that knowledge. And anyone with a computer can know more or less all that. We said that already. I'm going to skip to the third part of this, because this is a very interesting picture. Because time is, of course, of the essence, and we're talking about time, but it would take a lot of time to read these 5 pages about time. So the 5 pages about time are going to be omitted, and we're going to go straight to this picture, which is a bit of an inspiration for me. It's a photograph that I found in the archives of the Documenta, which are immense, the archives of the Documenta. And it could take years and years to go through them, and I just don't know what to do about that. But in the meantime, in a kind of random way, I found this anonymous picture by an anonymous photographer of 2 anonymous visitors of the 1959 Documenta. The floor seems dirty, rough, and irregular. The woman's movement is curious. She seems like she's moving laterally towards the left, as if she were about to stop and turn towards the sculpture on a metal plinth on her left. Her body weight is also shifted to her left foot, and this produces a deviation from linearity, from her movement forwards. This diversion could be due to her diverting her gaze from encountering his, by moving her attention to the artwork, as if the artwork were a polarity that allows her to move away from him, from any contact with his gaze. Her hand in front of her mouth indicates an increased attention towards the sculpture, but also a form of perplexity or perhaps surprise. But what could be surprising her? The photograph is interesting insofar as there is a dialogue between the two that passes through the artwork. In reality, there is therefore a triangulation. The next scene, of course, of this story is that in which the 2 of them talk together. I have to tone down the sound again. What's going on over there? The birth of the nation. In reality, there is a triangulation. The next scene is that in which the 2 of them talk together about the artwork. This sculpture by Julio Gonzalez that she's looking at is a device, dispositif, that allows the encounter and the dialogue to occur, like in an exhibition. Julio Gonzalez, of course, is a very interesting artist. This picture is from the Documenta that focuses on art after 1959. However, he died in 1942, which is interesting, because if you read about the Documenta of 1959 on the internet, you don't find that out. In Paris, he was older than the other 20th century early avant-garde artists, and he meets Picasso in 1890. But in 1904, their relationship breaks. No one knows why they were not friends anymore. From 1904 to 1928, it may have been a sexual question. In 1928, again, they become friends. And Julio Gonzalez teaches Picasso to weld. Welding is a technique that he had learned after working in the Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt. It therefore becomes the principal contribution to sculpture of Julio Gonzalez. The triangulation that occurs in the photograph is like an exhibition. The other sculpture one sees in the photograph has the shape of a face, and it's in the center of the image, slightly shifted to the right. It appears mute, a mute and blank face, as if figuration were ineffectual, without effect nor consequence. No one is looking at it. It is passive and indifferent. A few months before this picture was shot, in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista flees Havana when the forces of Fidel Castro advance. Alaska is admitted as the 49th U.S. state. Rebel troops, a few days after that, on January 4th, the day after Alaska is admitted as the 49th U.S. state, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos enter Havana. On January 4th, in Leopoldville, 42 people are killed during food fights between the police and participants of a meeting of the Abaco Party. In February, a referendum in Switzerland that same year, a few months before this was shot, turns down female suffrage. And 5 days after female suffrage is turned down in Switzerland, at Cape Canaveral, Florida, the first successful test firing of a Titan intercontinental ballistic missile is accomplished. However, just a few days after that, Walter Mene throws acid on a Rubens painting in Munich. And a few days after that, the Barbie doll debuts. But a few days after that, Eisenhower signs a bill allowing for Hawaiian statehood. And NASA announces its selection of 7 military pilots to become the first US astronauts. In June 3rd, Singapore becomes a self-governing ground colony of Britain. And on the 9th of June, the USS George Washington is launched as the first submarine to carry ballistic missiles. And that may well be the same day this picture was shot. And on August 14th, while this exhibition is still on, Explorer 6 sends the first picture of Earth from space. So much for the context. And we go back to the picture. So this blank face is ineffectual, without effect nor consequence. No one is looking at it. It is a passive and indifferent presence. A third sculpture is hidden behind the man in the photograph. It appears like a protuberance, like a tail or an organic element, something erected behind him, a hidden element. He holds his hands together behind his back in a strolling mood, like a flaneur, as if he were taking a walk and not really stopping to look at the artwork. He is in transit. She is in arrest. The photograph reminds me of Chris Marker's La Jetée, as it may have reminded you watching it now, which was filmed shortly after this photograph was shot and came out in '62, where the protagonist was able to concentrate and focus his attention to the degree of returning to the past through the image of and in a museum, an exhibition. In the story by Marker, the Third World War, I'm just going to say this even though you've all seen it, but it's such a pleasure to tell the story of La Jetée. The Third World War has already happened, almost everyone is dead, and the only survivors survive in the subterranean parts of the city. Some scientists who are in the underground world decide to experiment and send back in time some subjects to discover ways of survival for the future survivors. They send back a man after many attempts who had a string of childhood memories of himself as a child, seeing a man from the jetty of Orly Airport in Paris who is being shot dead. In these returns to the past, he meets a woman who probably was the mother of the child that he remembers. He seems to find himself in the same journey, and he looks at himself, and he is shot on the jetée of Orly. So the man killing himself was going back to his own past. The interesting thing in the film is they meet in the museum. So now to return to the Fridericiano Museum. We see the figurative, the abstract, and the relation between the figures. We see a long table or a plinth, a display system, probably in iron, with the object sculptures on it. These objects are transitional objects in the way that Winnicott may have defined them in the late 60s, shortly after the exhibition in Kassel. So as we all know, in the transition from being aware of the fact that you're no longer symbiotic with your mother to being a separate individual, transitional objects are essential, and trauma occurs when the object is taken away from them traumatically. But the necessity of being a not good enough mother is essential to the formation of the transitional object period, which is that of a holding environment, as an exhibition might be. And it clears us away from the subjective omnipotence of this Google age. So the transitional object is therefore an object that the child invests in psychologically to find defense from the anxiety of the absence of the mother. It's transitional insofar as it transitions from that, I said it already, but I'm going to read it, from a symbiotic relationship with the mother to a separate subjectivity without the mother. It's a special kind of object that is hard to take away from the child. The two sculptures that can be seen in the photograph are on a long table with a lot of space in between. They are objects that are devices. I've gone over time, but should I finish the talk about the photograph? Thank you. Okay, there are objects that are devices to create the relation. They are relational devices, one closer to the woman's image in the picture, one closer to the man's. The photographer wanted to create a mirror of the characters in the photograph, or at least to connect each one of them to a sculpture, to create two layers in the image. In the photograph, we live in a universe where each spectator, each member of the audience, has a sculpture of his or her own, has a sculpture at his or her disposal, and each person is indeed the sculpture. There is a particularity that all of you have noticed. She is barefoot. He is also particular. He hides a third sculpture behind him. He's wearing moccasins, and his socks are visible. His bare feet give an image of a time that is also freer than ours, less conventional than ours. At least in the art world, people were walking without shoes in the galleries. Probably she was wearing heels prior to that, and they're probably in her bag, and she's probably been walking around so much that her feet hurt. To be in touch with the earth, the pavement, suggests a form of sensuality and relation to life and to one's body in ways that the person next to her does not share. Bare feet are also related to ritual and the sacred. They're also related to the history of suicide. One enters a separate place, a sacred place, and one removes one's shoes. Under the table that's not exactly a plinth or a base, but is not part of the artworks either, there is a double of the table, a baseboard that divides the wall from the floor. The long table becomes a plane of action for the second layer of characters. The sculptures are smaller than the human characters. They function on a level that is therefore suspended from the ground, reduced in scale, like miniature beings, like bonsai. A curiosity is the temporal contradiction in the photo, which seems to belong to an impossible time. She seems dressed for summer with short-sleeved shirt and a straw handbag and naked legs and bare feet, while he seems to be in winter with a jacket, a tie, pants that are perhaps gray, and socks. In this tireless repetition of contingency, I found a related photo while excavating in the archive of Documenta. Oh, these are Julio Gonzalez images that I wanted to show you, because they suggest another time warp. I am quite sure this painting by Julio Gonzalez was not known to the photographer who took the picture. Other works by Gonzalez. I found this photo in the archive, and I found it, and it refers to the first Documenta, to 1955. Therefore, I think that Arnold Bode used the same plinth and moved it, and put Julio Gonzalez sculptures again in the exhibition in 1959. The reuse of the plinth in a different position is one of the most interesting possibilities of working with Documenta. Then I found this and discovered what was outside the frame of the picture. The pleasure of seeing what was to the left and to the right of the man that we just saw was enormous, a moment of joy and relief that the photograph is not only bounded by its edge and does not only allude to a world outside of the photograph, but actually can prelude to a world outside of the photograph, and that world is indeed inhabitable. To the left is Henri Laurent Surf, the surf, and further down at the back is Paul Klee Überchess, today in the collections of Zurich Kunsthaus. So that's all that I have to say about the Documenta 13. But I'm happy to take any questions. And of course, there's a relation. Hello.
Thinking on artworks as devices for dialogue, as you said it, describing this image, how do you think you can do that or provoke that in your project here next document?
I don't know. But I will try my best. I'm not sure. I think it has to do with working on procedures more than on themes with artists. No, it's not unrelated to drinking beer. That's a procedural shift. If you have some alcohol in your body, you might relax a little. So it's good for conversation. It's a procedural shift. Procedural shifts can be of many sorts. You know, I mentioned the no guards thing. That's not necessarily something I'll do, but I think in terms of procedures that are unbrandable. I think in terms of avoiding branding and working on procedures in all senses with people that are of various natures and various places and in an organic growth formation like a fungus. It just blobbily grows into something that will not be, hopefully, conclusive in any manner, but might not look like an exhibition, not necessarily.
How much of your process is going to involve, like, selection?
I never select. I really never have, even in the past. I never select.
So when you don't select, what do you do?
Well, now that's a question that we have to ask an analyst because I don't know. It just happens. I add. I go by addition, not by selection. It goes through conversations, conversations with artists, conversations between works. It's not a selection process. It's not that there's 150,000 people out there that I could select from. It's not like that. I don't know enough people that I don't know them. I just follow a life, and that life, there are people that come into this conversation, and it's like a train that picks up people along the way. And some people get off the train sometimes, and then they come back for the weirdest reasons that are absolutely you know, it might be a journey to a place. It might be someone comes to visit me. I think that that's not really the point. I think it's a lie when people say that they select. I don't think that that's true. And I don't like the politics of selection. So I just do what I think most people do, but I just say it, that I do it. Not everybody says it, that they do it. I try to keep open. It's like, how do you select what novel to read? I don't think you select what novel to read. I mean, there are some little things like you might read the New York Review of Books, but mostly it's a thing that has to do with processing what you know, what you've already read, and chance, and a friend giving you a book, and an author you like, and you want to read another book by that author. It's much more organic a process.
No, but the fact, the simple fact that everything has to come in contact with you is already a selection.
No, it's not a selection. Absolutely not. No, unless you believe in God, you know. But it's not a selection. It's a possibility of using chance and the random in an intelligent way. I mean, it's a question of improvisation. It's like asking a jazz person that's, you know, improvising, how do they select what to do next? It has to do with the relations with others. It's not, unless you're doing a solo, but, you know, I like to do solo exhibitions too with artists, and they're not just artists. It's not me alone and the artist. There are many other people that are curators, writers, thinkers, relatives, my daughter, she's, you know, really important to how I work with art and how she shows me something or tells me something, and that helps. So it's a group of people. It's like a group of people that grows and grows. And the only important rule is to keep it rather open. But I like to eschew any form of systematization of that. I mean, although a feminist, I've never done a show of women artists in my life. But there have been tons of women that I've worked with. You know, Susan Hiller and tons of women from the past, from the present. I don't like to use categories that can be branded, ever. And I see myself like a traffic controller, sort of, more than anything else. It's like being in a big square and it's all, and occasionally you let something go by this way and you let something, so it's more like traffic. I mean, not stupid traffic. I mean, you try to read something and see work. You try to see work and you learn. It's a process of learning. It's only a process of learning. And I think that's important because any grand theory, whether it's you know, a grand theory about globalization or how to deal with I think they're always tragic, ending in tragedy, usually. Being a bit of, you know, seeing how those things have worked in the past. So, but I also think that there are so many wonderful artists in the world that could be, say, in the Documenta, or could have been in Some New Minds, for example. Hi. But it was by chance, you know, it was by chance that I encountered this person or that person, and there was a conversation. And so I don't think of them as a selection. I think of them as a provisional, temporary, autonomous zone, an exhibition, which precedes others and comes after others. And it's just a moment. And so it's okay if in that moment it coalesces in that way. It's not, the important thing is avoiding a grand statement. Yeah.
So, talking about localities, how are you thinking?
How am I going to deal with Kassel and the local context? Well, whatever you want to call it, with Kassel. Well, that's a major question. It's a big question because the history of Documenta has been that of, insofar as it's a state of mind at this point, it's genetically connected with being a neutral platform. So the same way, say, the United Nations building is in New York. So if you ground the exhibition very much, it's like, it's a good thing, but it's a dangerous thing. I don't know how to do that because it would be like before a conference at the United Nations, you start to talk about the details of the type of the table and who built the table and when and what are the politics behind the construction of that table and the chairs and the positioning of the people. You may not have the meeting at the end. You may have a war at the end instead of the meeting. So how much do you want to maintain that neutral platform and how much do you want to ground the exhibition? But the third question, which you didn't bring up, the third problem, is how much do you want to dislocate it also, you know, like Okwien Wazor with platforms. So that's also very problematic because if you dislocate it, I mean, at what point are you doing, you know, a McDonald's, like it's code sharing with some airline somewhere else? And at what point are you just opening a McDonald's in Beirut? You know, why should anything be under the rubric of Documenta in San Francisco? You know, maybe and maybe not. So these three polarities, because there are three, not two, are things that I think about a lot. But I consult a lot with a lot of people, friends, people who work in the field in other parts of the world, in Europe. And for example, in Europe, you know, a modest proposal might be a very interesting one to do. For example, to investigate how globalization has impacted on European, or for that matter, German art, would be a very interesting exhibition. Because globalization runs parallel with the rise of the documentary mode, for example, for two reasons. One is because CNN was not doing those documentaries, so the artists did them, which is a good thing, you know, just for the purpose of communicating what was going on in the world in a more just and fair way. But the other reason is connected to the fact that there were ways in which dialogues could continue through the storytelling, and therefore connecting to Western histories and trajectories of film, Pasolini and so on, easier than through connecting to trajectories of, say, modernist painting and the abstract. So, and the other for example, the rise, you know, of a lot of really interesting work and performance going on in Europe might be also a consequence of globalization, in the sense that on the global platform, these, again, the history, the trajectory. I'll give an example. Tang Da Vu in Singapore founded basically the artist village in Singapore after '82, going to London, and he saw the voice thing at the Whitechapel, and he said, "Aha, we've been doing that for thousands of years, so maybe I'll connect to this culture in London through performance." And indeed, the importance of what's happened in Singapore or in other locations with performance through connecting to those other trajectories was enormous. But how that may have then gone back into, say, Europe is just because Kassel is in Europe. I mean, I'm not talking about San Francisco. I don't know enough about here. I don't even know enough about Europe. I don't know enough about Torino, for that matter. But to make to say that one could do a documenta just on that, you know, just on that. So it would be very much focused on sharing knowledge and producing knowledge within a place that is, say, you know, the question of why German contemporary art has sort of gone out of the picture is not just connected with the democratization of the art world and the opening of the art world. It's also connected to a certain difficulty of a culture that's very philosophically grounded on certain forms of rational thinking connected to, you know, that you find even in Habermas, even though he's critical of Kant. You have a hard time there dealing with that kind of fragmentation of multiplication and so on of thoughts. So there are many, many things that could be done, but I'm not going to do that show. But I might do that show another time. I mean, I just don't want to right now. I mean, I think there are things that I'm more interested in that have to do with what you're talking about. You know, oh, I have another slide, I think. It's a homage to the last lecture held here that someone let me scan very recently. You know, Dana Haraway did her talk here, so it's such an honor to be here, and she was here. And I kind of think that she would like that. So what I mean is there are a lot of forms of culture out there, and there's not just the culture of people. So the question is not, I mean, the question is way beyond just a question of dialogue between different constituencies and cultural groups around the world and trajectories. You know, the question is so much beyond that right now, I think. I mean, which involves that, but that's just a subcategory. Because if we were to think just about the problems amongst these different viruses that we are on the planet, you know, it would be really small-minded, I think. There's so many different kinds of viruses on the planet, you know, so many different kinds of species, and even what is alive is a question. You know, if we can still use those definitions for what is life, you know, those are very precise definitions, something that can reproduce itself without an external organism, you know, a cell and so on. But who knows? You know, some people think that stones are alive, you know, more alive, because they can do things that you can't do, like with a genetic in a lab. You know, so there's people that are interested in all sorts of things. I mean, even thinking about stones as being something particularly of our planet is really weird, given that there's so many meteorites, you know. A lot of things are a lot older than the world, and they're on the world. So these are interesting questions that I'm more interested in thinking about rather than doing the exhibition about the influence of globalization on German art. But I think somebody should do that, and I would really like to do that. And I think that it's a cliche, you know, to say that it's uninteresting to study what's going on in the heart of Europe. And it's a cliche to talk about periphery and center in the way that we do, because there's a periphery in every location and in every body and in every mind and in every cell and in every thought. So it's really complicated if you go into those general things, which is why I don't want to do I don't want, you know, a theme for the document. I have a title, but I don't have a theme. And the title, I can't remember. Like, I can never remember it. And I'm sure that you can't remember it. I'm sure you can't. Can anybody here remember it? You can? Oh, okay. So,